Hi there everyone. Today we're going to be discussing a few things in our art masterclass, but the big one is animating and interactive things. This is a topic that I think we very briefly covered last week in the previous masterclass, where we got into animating in a very low level. But today we're actually going to dig into a bit of a deeper level, and we're also going to look at how we can make interactive objects more easily. Now, there's a few ways we can do this in space, so we're going to start off with probably some of the simpler things that we can do with activators, and then we can sort of discuss the breadth of options you've got, such as scripting and everything else when you want to get it down and dirty into those levels. I'm not going to do a scripting tutorial today. I may cover it very briefly if we get time, but the goal today is really focused around things that artists in particular can work on when building environments to create things that are interactive without actually needing to learn much in the way of script. So, to begin with today, we are going to cover a little bit more on animation, and then we can move into how we can actually make these things interactive. The previous tutorial we finished off by making this tree that we had written the shader for change color as it moved around. So as you can see here, we have the object move through a timeline that'll rotate it back and forward. So as we play, it does that. Not very exciting, but just shows off the basics of what we can do with the animation timeline. Now, the next version of Unity that's coming out, 2017.1, that we are updating to, it's already out, but we're holding off until it gets a little bit more stable. That has a much more sophisticated timeline feature as well, that we will be supporting as soon as it comes out, and that's called Timeline. We won't go into that today, but that will be a topic that we cover sometime in the future. So, when we made this, let's do a quick refresher on this one. When we made this object, we just simply took the object, and I'll animate this one too, or this one here. We simply created an animation clip, so you go Window, Animation, then it brings up this panel. We create an animation clip for it, and we'll call this one Tree Animation 2. That now creates a whole timeline that we can actually animate any individual property on. So if we record an animation against this object, I'll just expand it so we'll animate the child again. We can hit record, select the child, and then do something with it. So in this case, I might make it scale up and down. So as you can see here, we've got, that's just a simple, well, actually that's the first frame, so we haven't animated. This is where it's going to start, and then we'll bring it back up to 1. So we'll just go 1, 1, 1, and now we can adjust the scale. We'll animate the scale through there. Now, if we want to loop this, there is actually a couple of ways we can do this, which I'll get to in a second. But there's one thing I want to cover first, and you'll see this particularly if we, as we hit play, and this is kind of hard to see, you'll see that it actually expands fairly quickly at the beginning and slows down a little bit at the end. And the reason for that is the curves. So if we actually go from this the drop sheet, which has the individual keyframes listed on it, and go to the curves, and zoom in, it's going to be actually a little bit hard to see because the scale is not very useful here. So let me make this a bit more pronounced. I'm going to go to this node here. I'm going to set the scale to 100. So just got a bit more of an obvious curve. Now we can see here. You can see it's also because it's looped. It's got that the pattern looping there. What you'll notice is that the curve is actually not a linear curve. So as it goes, it's going to slow down a little bit here. It's going to speed up through here. Now we can either play with this directly by altering the curve values, so we can actually scale these on different axes unevenly. So this one will actually shrink a little bit as it grows. We're going to need to switch off effects to actually be able to see things here. I'll switch that off, animated materials off as well. So this one we can see now is because we've changed the thing, it'll actually shrink on one axis as it gets down, and it'll expand on the others. So the axis that's shrinking on there is the sideways one, because each of these axes can be animated individually. So it goes through there. And you can see that's because of that little dip down there. Now, there's usually, if you're doing something, for instance, a windmill, and let me do one of those really quickly. I'm going to make a very, very basic windmill out of boxes. So I'm just going to go to create cube, and I'm going to make this guy tall, and it's going to be a very, very basic windmill. So that's roughly where we want it. Let's make that 90. So I'll just make a pivot for this one, so I'll create an empty child on there, which will be our pivot. We'll do this just because animating it's easier with a pivot for this kind of rotation. So I'll just move the pivot up to roughly the center of there. May or may not be 100% accurate, but we're not really caring about that today. So now when I spin this just manually, that should be on an evens. Hang on, one second, I'll just code an empty game object there. Just move the pivot onto there. That way that can be 1. We might need to scale these guys. This is not the world's fanciest windmill, I apologise. I've kind of screwed this one up. And the reason for that was because it had a scale on it when I parented it, and when I added and removed the scales, it got a little bit wonky because we were modifying it within the scale. So that should be 1, we'll set that to 1, we'll set that to 7. Okay. Might set that to 2. Okay. Now we've got our very, very basic windmill, and we've got a pivot roughly in the middle that we can rotate around. Very good. Okay. So, this guy we can add an animation to, and if we record an animation on the pivot, call this spin, and we'll spin on the x-axis. So if you were previously using scripts and things for spinning spinning objects around, that's actually not the best way to do it. The best way is here through an animation. One, it gives you greater control over how it looks. You don't need to write scripts every time you change something. And the second big perk to it is the animation system is quite efficient. Scripting will be slower than animations, less resource usage and so forth. The animation system is very efficient and quite useful for this kind of thing. So now we've got our pivot, we'll just record an animation. So we'll just start the x-axis on, put 0 in there just so we've got the starting point, and we'll say it takes 3 seconds to spin. So we'll just go to 3 seconds there. I'm going to set the animation to 360. Now if I wanted to do this spin twice in that period, I could actually do multiples of this. So I could do 360 times 2, which will come 720, and then when we rotate around. Now I'm not going to do that here just because I wanted to get to the, I want to better show the issues with curves a little bit more cleanly. So if we play this one, so it's speeding up, slowing down, speeding up, slowing down. That's not really terribly good as far as a windmill animation goes. The reason for that is because if we look at the curves, it's speeding up and slowing down there. So what we want to do is actually we can select both keyframes, we can right click on them and click both tangents, and you set them to linear, and this will cause the curves to align to each other in a straight line. So as we've got here, we've got a very, very clean timeline, and now when I hit play, this should, in theory, just loop nice and smoothly. See? Perfect. There's a seamless animation from start to stop. Now, we have a few options here on the curves as far as sort of how this animation goes. If we want to make it more comical, for instance, you may actually want to introduce some slowdowns and speed ups. Another option is if you want to sort of start-stop frames, what we could do is we could just add a key there, we'll add a key there, and we will say the right tangent here is constant. And now it's actually going to stop until it hits here when it finally rotates, so it creates a hard cut-off point on the curve there. So it'll animate linearly to that point, and then do nothing until there. These tangents are quite easy to play with. The free one is the one that we were just showing before, so we can do something like that. Playing with these can add a little bit of character to your items as well. Obviously that's a bit of an exaggerated example right there, but if you are in the process of making something like, for instance, a broken machine, then actually you might want to inject some noise into your path a little bit, so it doesn't quite go completely smoothly. So it might be like that, for example. And here you can see that it's going okay. A little bit of character to it makes things a bit more interesting, especially if you're trying to build something that's unique. Comic things, those kind of things, it could be useful. Play with the curves a little bit. There's a whole set of theory on how curves and things should behave with various objects that's sort of coming from web design and so forth, where they begin to play with curves quite a lot. But you guys can do it too, fairly easy. So that's the basics of doing simple keyframe animation, but also actually playing with the curves. Now we can actually make this a bit more interesting. We can actually play with going back to our tree. So we were talking about interactivity and things. So something you might want to do is actually you might want to add an on-off button to this, for example. Now there's a few ways we can play with doing an on-off button, and one of them could be doing it with speed. We could actually make some buttons on this that actually control the speed of the windmill, and do that entirely without scripting. Now what we're going to use for that today is something called a clickable activator. So I'm just going to create a cube. The only thing your activators need to do, I'm just going to move it to a line view there. The only thing activators need to have on them is a collider of some sort. So that case could be a box collider, a mesh collider, a capsule collider, whatever kinds of colliders. It just needs to have one there. And then to make it clickable, we just add clickable activator. It's a component that you've got available. And it brings up this nifty little thing. And I will quickly cover the properties here. So the main event is this on-click event, and that's what happens when you click on it. So what we can do is we can select, for instance, the pivot. We can drag that into the slot, and now we can use any component on the pivot. We can actually start calling programming events straight off here. Now most of these you don't really want to mess around with too much. They're pretty basic, or they may not do what you want. But what we could do is we could play around with the speed. So what I can do here is I can set the speed to 0. So now when this is clicked on, the animator speed is going to be 0. Now I can add a second button, which sets it to 0.5. Another one called 1, and we'll add one for 10. So you can play back at 10 times the speed. So that is a bunch of clickable buttons. Now, when I grab my player character, which I think is still in the scene from last week, but I'm not 100% sure. Yes, it is. So, we're going to go play with our windmill. And we'll just take a second to hit play. The very first time you hit play in a session, you might notice it takes a little while to actually kick in and run. And that's because it's grabbing and composing a whole bunch of settings and things that need to be compiled before it can actually hit play. So, if you pardon the wonky animations here, in-world characters look a bit better. The one we've got bundled in the editor pack is for size. It's only 1 meg of animations instead of 300 megs of animations we've got in the main player. Okay, so we've got our buttons. So the first thing we notice is that our windmill is spinning. That's the default play state. We covered that last week, but now I can hit the stop button, and here we go. It stopped exactly where I pushed it. So I can hit play. Now we're playing back at half speed. We can go hit stop again, play. That's twice speed, and we can go to our 10 speed. So that has been done entirely without scripting. There is so many events that we can actually apply off here. So what we might want to do is consider making this a bit more interesting with some pretty effects. So what we might do is we're going to actually play with particles. This was something I wanted to cover last week, but I didn't quite get the time, but this is an excellent segue into here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add a particle system to this tree. I guess I'll do it to this one. Now, particle systems in Unity are extremely powerful. You have the entire mechanism system that basically gives you complete control over how your particles look in almost any respect. So if you click here and add a particle system, you'll notice that I actually won't add it to this object. I'll add it to a new child. And I'm doing that just because it'll be a bit easier to organize and see with all those other components on there. So the first thing you'll notice is that it comes out pink, and that's because there's no material attached. So whenever you've got an object that doesn't have a material, you'll notice it comes out bright magenta, and that's because that's the default material that gets loaded. It's very obvious, so you can easily spot stuff that's been missing a material. So I'm just going to add the default particle to here. So it's just under renderer at the bottom. There's a room for a material. We'll just pick a particle. So we've got a particle, and there's the default particle one. Not very interesting. In fact, I'm going to swap it to another one. I've got this just a little bit more interesting. So the main thing about particles is that they're any material you like. They're just normal materials that you might use on game objects, but you usually use a particle shader attached to them. So those are the ones that start with particle and then finish with something else. Particle shaders usually do things like they've got not affected by lighting, or they might be lit themselves. Lots of various other bits and pieces. I won't cover that today, but the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to make this bright tree of ours sparkle. So I'll just turn the lighting back on. Okay, so now we can see this thing. Now, if we just attach this, and we rotate our particle system, you can see we've got some basic particles, but this kind of looks fairly dicey. So what we might want to do is make this a bit more interesting. So the first thing we'll do is add some noise. And noise basically causes the particles to drift around a bit as they move through the scene. So already this is looking a little bit better. We'll lower the size. We'll just increase the quantity a bit. So currently it's emitting 10 particles per second, but we're going to set this up to 50. Now that's all coming out of the shape here. You can see it's emitting from the base and then emitting out at those angles. So we can actually play with that a bit, make it a bit more straightforward. But what we're actually going to do is we're going to change the shape type. And we're actually going to set it to the mesh itself. So what we're going to do is select mesh renderer, because that's what we got. And where's my desert palm tree? Here we go. I'll just drop that in there. And now, with a bit of luck, it should be emitting from somewhere. Well, I see a particle there. We just have to find where it's coming from. We won't use the mesh colors. Align to direction. Hopefully that brings it out. This depends a little bit on the mesh itself, how these particles come out. I'm just trying to find where they are. They're definitely somewhere. Let me see if I can get these guys out. Where is my mesh? So I've got that one. Are they coming out from somewhere else? So this comes from not sure why these aren't emitting from here actually. I'll just do it with a normal mesh then. It's a bit of an odd one. Because we've done that now, we've actually got the particles are all emitting from a single point, which is what you can see there. Hopefully with a bit of luck we can make this behave. So I'm just going to grab that mesh. Where is it? Here. Which looks like there. Just drag the mesh in the slot. Hopefully we... Oh, it might be a scale issue. I wouldn't be surprised if it was actually. Scale, let's try. Yep, that's looking a bit more likely. Okay, here we go. So you can see now that actually we do have a blue outline of where the particles are coming from. So this is coming from the edge here. So I'm just going to slow the speed down of these so you can actually see them coming off the particle. So it's quite slow. And we will align to direction. And I'll remove these randomizations. So this is now emitting from the edges on the mesh. So we can set this to vertice, in which case it'll emit from each individual vertice. And as you can see with the noise we've got on here, we're actually producing a nice little walled pattern. I'm not sure why these guys are picking up any velocity at all, but they seem to be. Oh, it's coming from here. This is why. Without the noise component on, you'll see that they're actually just emitting from there. So we'll set the speed back up in a second, but first things first, we'll set these to come from the triangles. So that means any point on the mesh basically could be emitting a particle. If we set that to 1, you'll notice they'll emit from the mesh. It's like that. So here we go. We've got a bit of an interesting pattern coming out of here. Now we're actually going to make a button which causes the tree to emit a bit of an interesting pulse. So what we're going to do is we can alter these emission rates, and I'm going to set this to 0. And actually I'll just set it to 1 just so I can get the 100. Just so I can get this line back up. So first things first, I'm just going to set the position of this child to nothing, and that way, as it's rotating now, we've got this coming off the surface. I think our scale is a little bit off when I was looking at the mesh there, and that's probably because there is a scale attached to this. So what is that? Okay, so it's 0.02. That's what our mesh scale should be. So let's drop that in there. Okay, there we go. Now we've got particles coming off the side. So one last little trick here. We're going to add a trail to this, and you can see here that there's something coming off it. I'm just going to set the speed up as well. So spot speed to 1. That's a bit too much. Well, this will be rather interesting. So we've got that one. Now we need to assign a material for the trail render as well. So I'm just going to set that to the same. I've got one already. There we go. So this is our neat little tree. What we could also do is just add a gradient to the trail. So I can do this color over trail here. I can set that to a gradient, I think. There we go, gradient. And now I can make this line up a little bit with our tree. So our tree is going between sort of a bluey color and a yellow color. So let's grab bluey color. And we'll grab a yellowy color, which is what the other paired color it's got on it. Let's move that around a little bit. And finally, I will just set start color on this one to. It will actually multiply these values together as well. Okay. Anyway, that gives us the basics of something that would be kind of cool to see come off this. So I'll just add our noise back in. And if you've seen the assembly, this is how I built the assembly tree. So now we're going to take our emission off. We're just going to set the rate down to 0. And we've got this, I'm just going to name this for convenience. This is our particle. Now, our mesh already has a collider attached to it. It's got a mesh collider here, so that means we can just add the clickable directly to this. I'm just going to add a clickable activator. I'm going to drag the particle emitter in. I'm going to select the particle system, and then there should be emit. So this is the programming value we'd use. Now, if you're using Unity scripting, you can actually call these directly, but you can't here. So I'm just going to set this to emit 200 particles every single time it's clicked. So, when we hit play, we will see that this tree is now clickable. We've got all sorts of things in the background, but okay. So, click the tree. Sorry, I think something's actually playing with my mouse. Oh, it's the animation we've got attached to it. This is caveat about leaving things attached, so I'm just going to turn this animation off. I should have realised that one. The reason it wasn't scaling the tree was because it was marked static, which we got tripped up by last week as well. Should know better. Okay, so now we've got this one, and you can click it. You see that we actually emit a whole bunch of particles that will have a 5-second lifespan. So click it, you get a cool little effect. Now we could make this more interesting using a animator. So instead of actually just doing this entirely from here, what we're going to do is actually make the tree pulse. And we might need to add some shader variables and things to do this, but let's see how far we can get on our own. So first things first, I'm just going to delete this animation off it. So I'm just going to remove the animator. And now I'm going to select here and just add a new animation. I'm going to call this pulse. Just going to add this just got this pulse animation. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to alter the, we're not going to actually pulse the emit value anymore. We're actually going to do this entirely through animation, and then we're going to have just the animation start. And when the animation runs, it's going to brighten the tree and emit a whole bunch of these particles at once. So the first thing we do is we just start recording. We're just going to make the material a bit brighter. So I don't know what I can do here, but I'm sure I can do something. So there we go. So I'm going to go to 282 as our default value. So I'll just add a keyframe in there, and then it's going to take half a second almost half a second, 0.4, so 400 milliseconds. We're just going to brighten this up over those 400 milliseconds before reducing over 1 second to back down to how it was. So now, when we hit play, just so we see it, we go boom, like that. In fact, that may not be coming up fast enough, so we'll just drag that keyframe back there. So now we go boom. And I might just add a little bit of a keyframe here in the middle where we lower the value back down a bit faster. So what we got is we've got a pulse and then a slow pull down. In fact, I'm going to move that a little bit faster in. So it's 100 milliseconds right now. I'm going to move it to fractionally. So the closer you get it to when the user actually clicks, the more responsive it feels. So that flashes up. I'm not sure that's bright enough, but what we can do is, oops, we can go here, select this one, and we'll just make that a bit even brighter than it is now. So it's going to be like there, and we're going to change the color. Well, that's quite bright. Maybe we've gone a bit too far. But there we go. Now we go boom. And we'll just lower him back down. So what color were we originally? We were a greeny color, I think. Bluey color, I think we were somewhere around there. So we'll set that and add a keyframe here. So there we go. Let's go boom like that. Okay, so that's the first thing first. Second thing we're going to do is we're going to animate the particle emitter. What we're going to do is we're just going to edit the rate over time. So we're going to set the rate up to, I'm going to set a burst at 0. Actually, I won't do that, but I will do rate over time up to, so we'll start here at 0, so I'll just set that to 1, just so it adds a node, and you can see when it turns red when it's animated on the timeline. So it's at 0.5, we're going to set the rate up to 500, because we're going to bring it right back down. This might lag a bit. So we've got 1,000 particles there. That's fine. And then here we're going to set it back down to 0. So now, and what we might want to do here as well is we're going to change the start color. So I'm just going to record that start color. I'm just going to add a new property for it. Okay, so we've got that one. Here at 0.5, we're actually going to make all the particles white. Apologise, this seems to be lagging a bit today. It's probably because we've got so many particles and the noise module does tend to make a bit of a lag while you're actually editing. So here we go. There, and then finally here, we're going to set this back to what we had before. So, now we've got an animation that goes boom, lots of particles, stops. So, we can play with this one in a second, but there's one last thing I want to do here. Is I'm going to stop animating. So this is now set in stone, and any change that I make won't go on the timeline. I'm actually just going to change how the particles look over time, because you notice when the particles start and the stop, they sort of just cut out. So what I'm going to do is, first things first, is I'm just going to set the width over, sorry, the trail render. It's going to be width over trail. Is that no? It's the lifetime. I'm just going to set the lifetime to something less than 1. So we're going to set that to 0.8. So the trails finish before the particle itself dies. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to edit the color over time. So I'm just going to set a color. And what I'm going to do is just alter the alpha. So I'm going to start these particles. They're going to appear at almost, they are going to appear at nothing. They're going to quickly ramp up to 100% alpha, which means they're fully visible. And then what's going to happen is we're going to just slowly taper them off towards the end. So I'm just going to set the last values to 0. So you can see there's black, white, white, black. And that means that when these play, they're going to look a bit more obvious that they are sort of dying naturally. So when I hit 50 here and just simulate, you'll see here it slowly dies. So it doesn't actually sort of vanish all at once, and it's a bit more natural. So that's the first first part of our thing done. We've got our nice little animation of the palm tree that emits things when glowing. The next step is actually triggering the animation. So we covered this yesterday a little bit, I mean not yesterday, last week, a little bit on the animations and how triggers and things work. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to grab this animation controller, and as you can see it's just going straight into a full sort of pulse, if you will. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the loop off it, so I just select the motion, go here, and I can set the loop time to not looped, and that means it'll only play once. But more importantly, we need a start and end state, so this will be the idle state. The name doesn't matter, I'm just setting it for convenience. I'll just set those as default states. Now it won't actually do anything by default, it'll be at the 0 mark permanently, or before it's even been modified. So just make an animation, a transition, so that means this will transition to from here. We're just going to set a condition. So the first thing we do is we add a set of parameters. So in this case I'm going to use triggers. Triggers are single fire parameters, so they can sort of just be used for instant actions. So I'm just going to call this one pulse. And then I'm just going to make this only happen when pulse is true. So there we go. That's all we need to do. We'll just add a pulse there. Now when it's done, I'm going to have it transition back automatically to this idle state. So it'll sit back in idle waiting for another pulse. So one other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove this has exit time. That means it's got to play the full animation, or full transition before it moves back. Now because there's no animation here, that will be instant, but in case of you doing stuff, you may want to consider that. And that means that if it goes straight back to this idle state, so it can be ready for another pulse almost straight away. Okay, so there we go. That's our animation. I'm actually going to remove the exit time for this one too. That way we can click the button lots of times to reset the animation each time we click play. There is a slight transition duration on here of 0.25 seconds, which may be too short anyway, but okay, so here we go. We've got our animation set up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab my thingy. I'm going to remove this particle system emit, so I just select that one and click the minus button to delete it. I'm just going to add a new one in here, which has got our animation controller. I'm just going to animator. I'm going to hit set trigger, which should be in here. And we've got the trigger name here as pulse, so I'll just type pulse into here. And now, with a bit of luck, we should be able to click it and have it pulse. Okay, so it's playing the animation by default. That it shouldn't be, but maybe the particle emitters. Oh, we left the emission rate on. So something to watch out for. If you leave the default values on, it will use those. Great, here we go. Just wait for my little loop to load. Okay, so now we have our magical tree. And I will just get to a better view. We'll click it, and boom, it pulsed. Now it should be playing through those animations, so click it, and you can see actually it's getting stuck there on the end. And I'm not quite sure what it's waiting for. Okay, so I did need to leave that exit title on, so I'll just, yep, leave that on, play. Because it didn't have the have exit time, it actually was never exiting the animation for some reason. Okay, so here we go. Play, and it pulsed very briefly, or flashed very briefly, and we got a bunch of particles emitting from it. Not the most interesting of animations, but still, it's we can push it lots of times. As I said, not the most interesting of little animations, but it does show the potential for what you can do here as far as animating goes. Now, if I don't want to go into the animator and edit those values, because I don't like the curve as it is, you can actually edit these animations at runtime as well. So, which one are you? You are that one. So this is the one that spikes up to 500. And we can actually drag that up even further. So instead of emitting 500 particles, let's see how it looks at. We're going to set it to even higher. might set this up to hold down shift, it'll move just up and down. So now, if we do take that one out and go bing, you can see we've got a much larger number of particles. I think that looks a bit better. That will be saved, just for reference. That will persist as we go out of play mode. You can see here that the value is still there. So when we go back into it, it will persist, and that lets you sort of tweak these things at runtime and get a feel for them. And the perk of doing it all this way instead of using scripting is that you're able to do this without having to get a script started and stopped. It's quite easy to sort of refine the look of it. So there we go. That's our animated tree. So the next things that we want to sort of cover off, I think, so we've covered the basics over here. Let's cover off a few more quick interaction types before we move on to the next thing. So the one we've covered here is called Clickable activator, and that basically happens when you click on the object and it's got a collider. There are a few other options to this. The other ones are networked. So this indicates that you want the effect to run on the server instead of just on the client. That means that when one person clicks it, everyone can see the action. If you don't leave this ticked, then it'll only show for the local user. So if you're doing, for instance, games and things where you want to have a different experience seen by every player as they progress through, and there are plenty of cases where you might want to do that. Say, for instance, the user unlocks a gate or something that is part of a quest line or something like that, then you don't necessarily want to do that for all users at the time. In that case, you leave networked off. And then the other two I will only briefly cover, and that's network ID. We derive a global ID on objects based on a bunch of factors, but if you want to manually specify the network ID, say for instance you want to link two things to happen, two different remote clickables, you could actually give them the same network ID, and then both would fire when one player clicks any of them. So that's just something to think about. That only applies when you've got networked on, but is a useful little side effect. Finally, you can also set the tooltip. I don't know if we'll actually see this in the editor. We should be able to, but that's if the user leaves the mouse cursor over the item for a second or two. It should. I'm not 100% sure this will actually show in the editor. It definitely does show in the client. No, it doesn't, unfortunately. So if the user leaves their cursor over the item, it'll show that bit of text there. So you can use it for instance, click to open this door or whatever you want to do with the Clickable activator. So that's the first type. The next ones are, we have proximity activators. Very broadly similar thing, except we've got two types of events here. We've got activate, which happens when the user gets in range, and deactivate when the user gets out of range. Now you can do a few things here. First is you can ignore owner. That means that it'll ignore the user, so it'll only happen for other users. Now this comes into play with networked things as well. So you can use this for having it happen when other avatars enter that area. Your player will see it. And you've got the inverse, which is the tick below, which is client only, and when that's ticked, it'll only do it when your character sees it. So other avatars in the scene won't trip the proximity activator. By default, the behavior will be all avatars can trigger the effect. Again, this is sort of useful for big particle effects, things like that could be distracting if everyone is doing it at once. So depending on what you want, you can actually sort of hide it so only the end user can see that effect happen on their own avatar. The basics, the other parameters are pretty straightforward. Minimum distance and maximum distance. If you've got minimum distance specified, then it acts kind of like a donut, that the center will be hollow. It won't trigger when the player's in that area, but it will trigger when the player's between minimum and maximum distance. So you can use that to sort of define the two radiuses. If it's a 0, then it'll only be the maximum radius that's used, and that means how far away the avatar needs to be before the proximity event will fire. That's calculated from the player's feet, incidentally. It's not calculated from the chest or the body or anything like that. It is a 3D distance, so it's not just using the X and the Z axes, it's using all X, Y, and Z. So just be aware that the player's feet is where the distance is calculated from. You also have an activate and a deactivate event. So the activate event happens when the player gets within that area. Deactivate happens when the player gets out of that area. That one's, other than that, fairly straightforward. There's not a lot to it. We have added another activator recently, I believe, as well. Yes, we have the collider trigger activator. Now, this one is similar, except it requires a collider of some sort attached, and it needs to have isTrigger set on it. So when isTrigger is ticked, it basically means that the mesh is used, or the other collider is used as the bounds of it. So if you've got, for instance, got a room that you want the player to have an event activate when they walk into it. You can use a box collider with isTrigger ticked on the collider itself, and then you can use the trigger activator. And again, it's the same properties as the proximity activator. It's got an enter and an exit event, and it also has one for covering whether it's only the owner or whether it excludes the owner. Same as the proximity activator, just gives you a bit more fine-tuned control because you can make meshes or you can do other things with colliders. If you have multiple colliders attached to a single object and they've all got triggered set, it'll be triggered from any of those colliders. So you can also use that to create compound areas and things like that. Okay, so that covers some of the very basics of interactivity. What it is also worth talking about is just the sheer volume of things that you can plug in here. So for instance, in these events, let's say we've got this guy here, we want to make it pink. We can actually trigger on other objects too, so I'm just going to make a new material for this one. I'm going to call it, because we're not going to use animations for this, we're just going to call this pink windmill. I'm just going to set the color to something like that. There we go. Now, by default, this has got the default material attached to it, but what we can do is with our activator, we can drag, what's this one called? Cube 3. Let's drag Cube 3 into here, select the mesh renderer, and we can actually set the material. So what we can do is we can swap the material, and I'm going to set that to pink windmill. And now, when we click this object again, you'll notice we actually can modify the other object, and we can change the material that's attached to it. Now, I'm also going to make that pink windmill a bit brighter too, so I'll just change this. You can also edit materials at runtime as well, and the values don't revert between them. So now we've got a bright pink. So I just click this one, and boom, there we go. That modified this one. Now I've got a little bit of Z fighting there, but besides that, now if you do that over and over again, it's just going to keep replacing the same material, so it's not going to swap back. But hopefully that's sort of a useful little exercise here. So that covers probably the very basics of activators, those kinds of things. We covered particle systems a little bit. I'm just going to look up my quick list because there's a few other small things on here that I did want to get into besides these. One other sort of sorry, now I've lost my train of thought. So we'll come through here and we'll cover scripting very briefly. So scripting has access to these kinds of things as well. So if you've looked up our scripting documentation, we do have a fair number of methods wrapped from the Unity engine, plus several of our own ones. But it is worth noting that scripts have access to these event-style activators as well. And between them and animations, you can pretty much edit and modify anything in the scene using those options. So if we grab the scripting runtime, one of the things worth noting here is that the scripting runtime has these events attached to it. So I'll just create a new empty object, add a script runtime to it, and if you can see here, there's events. So you can actually add an event. You have to give it a name, because that's how we reference it and know how to trigger it. So here what we can do is we can create an event, and we'll call this at start, and this will run when the thing starts. We'll set the quick script to do that. And here again, what we can do is we can make this other one, so it was a cube 2, you're the one who was left out. What we can do here is we can take the material. We can also change things like the position of an object. If you go through transform, you can change all sorts of other things, set the parents, use send message if you've got scripts and things that you know exist on there. A whole bunch of additional parameters and things that you can use these events to trigger. But here we're just going to do the same thing as we did before. And I'm just going to make my pink windmill, I'm going to make a green one. Greenish. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to make this pink windmill, grab the script runtime, and we're just going to set the material on this one to this second material that we've got. Now, to use these, the script method for them, I am going to quickly look up because I don't know off by heart, but I'm pretty sure it's off host. I believe. So if you look up our scripting documentation, we've actually got sort of machine documentation and everything. So there we go. Yeah, so you just simply go space.host.invoke event, and we'll just put in at start. So this script here will execute the @start event when it first starts up. Should be fairly straightforward. Just hit play. And with a bit of luck, if I didn't screw that up, it should. There we go. At start, it's replaced that material as it's gone. So between those, you can use those as a way of making scripts that can be used by artists. For instance, if you've got a script on your team, they can pass through a prefab which has got the scripting runtime attached to it, and then they can leave these things as sort of configurable properties that you can fill in things. So for instance, if someone makes a script that's got a fancy vendor or whatever, you can swap the objects and materials and things in at the script, and the script can use those as simple resources. So click play on the other one, and there we go. We replaced both the materials on there through the scripting. Plenty of other things can be played with there. Obviously, our full scripting library has got quite a lot of elements on it. Final things I want to just cover off quickly because we've got 10 minutes left today, and that is all the various components we've got built in. Unlike a lot of other sort of virtual worlds out there, we've spent a lot of time looking for common components that you are likely to need when you're doing things. And I'll just cover off a couple of the quick ones here, but there is a huge list of them. If you take a look at our space pack directory, there's a directory and they're named linkages. It's actually got the full list of all the extra components and things that we provide to you. Because there's quite a few in there. And they've all got various functions and uses. Most of them will show up through the add components system. So you just go here, you can see that we've got space and a whole bunch of ones in here. So for instance, interactivity, we've got our activators there. We've got media surfaces, browser surfaces, streaming video, that kind of thing. All just pops in here. So when you need a script to do something, chances are we've actually already got it. So we can have a look at a quick one, which is the focus camera component. This lets you actually create sort of telescopes of sorts. So I'll just create a new blank game object, and we'll do a seat next after this one. What I can do here is I can create a focus camera. So it's just a focus camera component. Just select that there. And then it's got a property for a set target camera position. So what I can do is I can create a new child. Now I can get the editor camera where I want it to. So let's say we want this focus camera to get this shot. So this is the shot that we want to have the thing appear. So we just go game object, align view to select, align with view, and that will actually move this game object we just got selected. You can see it's actually positioned now where the origin of the camera was a second ago, or the scene camera. So I'm just going to drag this guy into here. So it's a child on here. I'm just going to drag that into the focus camera position. Now by default, this one works just by a clickable. So we'll use this being similar to a clickable. Just wait for me to load in. There we go. Okay, now where's my box? There. So now what I can do is I can just click this box. I should be able to click this box. I just realised I'm using a broken editor pack. I apologise for that. Normally, once you upload that, you're about to click, so I do apologise for that. That's on me. I'm working with some experimental editor packs at the moment, and the camera is misbehaving. In fact, this is a slightly older one, but you should be able to use that to sort of focus the camera where you want to go. So it actually will move the camera right to there. That will work when you upload it in the viewer though, just instantly if you are using one of my experimental editor packs. So next one we want to cover off is seats, for instance. Seats, similar deal. So we'll just create a new cube here. We will actually get some better seats coming soon that have got support for IK. We have a full inverse kinematic system, so we're actually going to be using it to let you position arms and feet and things for seats rather than having to make animations by hand, which should save some people a lot of time. I don't know what I've got in the way of seating animations here, but we're about to find out. So I'm going to use a seat. You'll notice that seat improved. What it'll do by default is actually align the green to, roughly speaking, where our default seating animation sits for a 2 meter tall avatar, which is the default, but it's not quite accurate. Now if we swap in an actual animation, so what have I got in here? I've got a sit. What have I got in here that will work? So we'll take a quick look through our animations. Let's see if I've got anything in this directory that looks appropriate. Sleep, what's that? Yeah, that'll do it. That's our seating animation. It's a little bit busted, but hey. So you can just click on the green part if you want to select it, but I'll just set this one to here. So I'll set the animation to sleep. And you can see here, it'll actually give you a preview of how, again, a default avatar will look when using that avatar. Hopefully that's sort of helpful when it comes to positioning and things. So if I, again, hit play on this guy, and hopefully this one is working in this editor pack. Remind me to actually test and not use experimental ones doing these videos. Okay, so here we go. Oh, for God's sake, what have I done now? Have I done something stupid? There's always a good chance I have. So 1 second, let me have a quick look here. No, apparently I've got a broken editor pack. That's a bit of a shame. Normally this stuff's a bit more straightforward, so I do apologise to my viewers, but that is the basics of using seats. There is a whole bunch of components here which you can use besides the seat improved and the focus camera. We can take a quick look through here to see what there is. This is everything to do with vehicles and everything else that's attached to objects. So for instance, vendors, those kinds of things. So I'll just go space pack, linkages, you can browse through the list. So what else do we have? The activity button is one we added recently. No, it's not the one I was thinking about. Some of the stuff here is internal, and I don't generally recommend going through this list as the basics of what you're doing. Okay, so if you've got water in your scene, for instance, there's a buoyancy component which would just let you attach sort of things that will float on the surface appropriately. That's one example. If we go car vehicle, you can sort of see it's got the basics of setting up a car. The goal here is basically to build instant interactivity without a lot of work on your part, because all the parameters and things are pre-configured within ranges that make sense. So if I go for instance, the new modular vendor, that should be in this editor pack. Go to modular vendor. For instance, here, if you're actually selling items in world, what you can use these modular vendors, you can actually click whether it's going to sell one item or a catalog of items. You can drag and drop a bunch of fields in here. So in case this one actually uses what's called UI fields, and it's probably another good one to show if you're going to build interactive surfaces using GUIs. We will cover this one a bit more in another topic, but I'll just give the basics today. So the first is you need to build a canvas. Now the canvas by default will be quite huge, as you can see here, and this is basically where your thing will render onto. I'll just take lighting off so we've got actually able to see this. Now this is huge, and it's also going to render onto the screen. So if we add a game object, let's say add a panel to it. Panel, there we go. What I can do is I can go here, use this thing controller to move the panel around. This could be part of our game's interactive components or anything else we're doing. So if you can see here, you actually see that panel right in here in the middle of the screen. Now for some people, having it over on the screen itself is going to be useful, but actually having it in world might be useful too. So we can actually make these canvases interactive inside the environments. So I'll just go back here. Just reselect here, and I'm going to turn this one into a world space canvas, and that means that the canvas is actually going to sit in the environment itself. So I just changed the render mode to world space, ignore everything else, and I'm just going to set the size down because it's still huge, because it's measured in pixels there. I'm just going to set the scale down to 0.01, 0.01, 0.01, 0.01, and with a bit of luck, that's somewhere less huge now. We just need to find it. What I'll do is I'll just align this one to view to find it. There we go. So this is now a 3D object in the scene that's got a canvas attached to it. What we can use here is we can actually attach text, buttons, all that kind of stuff onto here. All the goodness that you see that our own user interface is built this way. So anything you can see in our user interface, for example, can be built this way using the canvas system. So I can this is just be a bit of text. Make it quite big, and I'm just going to drag this around to here. Now, this canvas could actually be hooked up to a button, and the great thing about this is that it can do everything that all of our activators can do too. So what I can do here is I've got our in-world canvas, and I'm going to add a button to this. So I'm just going to go game object UI button. This just selects a basic one. Now the style of the default buttons is kind of you can do better. You can make your own styles if you want to for buttons and all kinds of things to fit with whatever your game is. But I'm just going to add this quick button here. I'm actually going to make our tree pulse. So I'm just going to find our tree, just going to drag it in the animator, set trigger, set it to pulse. And on our button, I'm just going to call this make tree do stuff. And This is our button. I might just change the images around. You can see all of our default ones are included in here, so you can actually make stuff that looks like our user interface if you want to. So somewhere around here, we've got our button. Maybe not the best one to use, but green button, there we go. So this now looks kind of like our own buttons. I'll just change the color of this one to white, because that's what our ones use. Make it a bit bigger. Okay. Here goes the basics. So hit play. Okay. And then, around here, we should have our little canvas. You can press it, and the tree does stuff. So you notice that here it even has mouse over effects. That's not very pronounced, but we can make this more pronounced. So I'll just go highlight color, and set this to red, and it'll multiply. So you can see here that when you mouse over it turns red, click it, turns something else, and it does stuff. Pretty straightforward, but it means you can build all sorts of complicated things. You can animate the UI canvases, you can do whatever you like with them. They're pretty straightforward. And that's probably a good place to end today on interactivity. Hopefully you've seen that you don't actually really need to use scripting to build rich interactive experiences in space. It's pretty straightforward. We've got components for everything. The first point of call for anything you want to do here will be the wiki. Our wiki has a listing of most, if not all, of our components. I know the new ones do take a little while to get onto the wiki as far as documentation goes, but if you do need some information about components that aren't documented on the wiki, please just feel free to ask on the forums or in any of the developer groups that we maintain, because we're happy to help, and we will actually move stuff onto the forums as time goes on. Also, we've got them on YouTube as well. So thank you all for listening in today. I'm going to go do my office hours as usual. If you need, if you have any suggestions for next week, I'm listening. I will probably be going back to covering a bit more on special effects and that kind of thing. I particularly want to cover off things like how to make good-looking water, volumetric lighting, that kind of thing, which I haven't quite given enough justice to just yet. But it was good to get all this interactivity stuff out, because I know that a lot of people are interested in it. Thank you all, and I will see you all in a minute. Thank you.